All right. Thank you so much. First of all, I just want to say before we get started, Morgan, Katrina, thank you so much for making time to chat with us today. We're always so grateful here at RaiderIO to be able to speak with you guys, get a sense of what's going on behind the scenes, bring some of that, awesome development information to the community. Morgan, it's really great to see you again. Katrina, haven't had the pleasure, but excellent to meet you. I guess before we get started, can you guys take just a couple minutes to introduce yourselves, let everyone know what it is you do for World of Warcraft. Katrina, we can start with you maybe.
Yeah, of course. So hi, I'm Katrina Yepiz. I'm an associate encounter designer. So that means I'm responsible for creatures in the game and their abilities. So designing towards those. And then Morgan, if you want to go ahead.
Yes, my name is Morgan Day. I am one of the associate game directors on World of Warcraft, mostly responsible for The War Within and other future projects. But yeah, I've been on the game and on the team for, I think this year is 20 years. So
oh, wow.
A hot minute, as it were. So very excited to be talking about the Undermine update today and tell you kind of all about the mean streets of Undermine and all the cool goblin stuff coming.
Yes, congratulations on 20 years. That's quite an accomplishment.
Thank you.
That's awesome. What is the 20-year? Do you get the sword at 20?
It's a crown. It's
epic.
You
get a crown, and you're not wearing it. I'm disappointed.
Oh, and you should not wear it. It would stab you. It's It's very much a decorational crown.
Okay. Good to know.
Yeah.
All right, we won't make you wear the crown. I guess for everyone else out there, and Katrina, since we haven't met, I'm Hula Hoops. I'm the general manager here at RaiderIO, and long-time WoW player. I've been playing since vanilla, so personally super excited for Undermined. The goblins, the story behind it, it looks really, really neat. The raid testing, the raid looks fantastic. So whatever hand you both had in that, kudos. I guess I will just go ahead and get started. I've got a handful of questions regarding Mythic Plus and some regarding raid. So I'm just going to hop right to it if that's all right with you.
Yes, please.
Okay, so I'll start with Mythic Plus dungeons because, as you know, RaiderIO, that's kind of it's what we do. It's our bread and butter. We love our dungeons.
It's your jam, yeah.
Yes, something that has become a pretty standard part of the Mythic Plus ecosystem is bringing back old or legacy dungeons into the dungeon pool each season. Making sure we're not doing the same 8 dungeons for an entire expansion, keeping things fresh and exciting. When updating these legacy dungeons, what are the key factors that influence the decision to rework an encounter, such as the upcoming changes we're seeing to Tussle Tonks in Mechagon, or removing the mind control tech on the squirrels?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'll answer part of the question that you didn't ask, which is also there's a whole element of what is the dungeon pool, right? Like how do we pick those dungeons? And a key part of that for us is one is thematics, right? Like it's not a coincidence that we're going to Undermine where there's tons of goblins, and we're also bringing back the Motherlode, which is a BFA dungeon or Battle for Azeroth dungeon in the season. So very much we looked at thematics, but we also looked at things like we always like to make sure we have a dungeon pool that can highlight different strengths and weaknesses of our classes. So, a dungeon like Theater of Pain was very focused on like big, scary lieutenant creatures. There wasn't as many like massive pulls in that dungeon, and that was something that we felt our dungeon pool was lacking. So we wanted to bring that dungeon in. And when it comes to your specific question about how do we, decide to change a mechanic or not. Ultimately, it's about presenting new challenges and injecting novelty, right? Like some players could have seen these dungeons before. So we want to make sure that it still feels fresh and novel when returning for a season. So often we'll just make changes to inject some novelty and maybe also to, smooth over some rough edges of some of the past encounters. Like, for instance, I was just talking about Theater of Pain, Kultharak, or the Lich, because I'm bad at proper names. Previously, that boss hinged a lot on, like, magic dispels, which put a lot of pressure on the healer, and we wanted to make some changes to kind of spread that challenge out across the full group. So more of a like group challenge versus specifically something that you lean on the healer for. But it also at the same time we feel like kept the core fantasy of the boss intact. So that was just kind of a twist on an existing or on a past approach. Tussle Tonks, I think you mentioned that one, which is in Mechagon. That encounter really focused on positioning the bosses at specific points in time. And we wanted to just kind of update that to, again, keep those challenges. But really, the focus was on quality of life, like executing that mechanic a bit more consistent. So that was very much a focus with something like that, where we want to keep the spirit of it, but really just look at the execution and ultimately kind of the fairness of it, right? When you feel like, oh, that's that wasn't supposed to happen. It feels unfair to the player. We want to look at moments like that so it can feel more tactical. And then I think you mentioned the squirrels.
The squirrels, yeah, the mind control on the squirrels.
That's an interesting one, right? Like the MC tech is super fun. Like we love when players have opportunities, like I said, to use their tools and create advantages using those tools. But there's a band that we feel like, all right, this is where this feels like a cool advantage, or I'm getting to take it, or I'm getting to kind of feel like you're cheating. But sometimes that can really skew the approach, and also sometimes make it feel like, hey, this isn't doable without X, and that feels like it becomes out of band. So we take a look at that. I mean, ultimately, that was one where we could have just tuned it to be more based on the player power, where that one was placed on was more on the dungeon's power, right? So that damage was scaling with keystone level, no matter what your item level was. So an approach there would have maybe just been make it scale with the player's power level instead of the dungeon's power level, and that could have resolved that problem. And actually, an example where we did do that is in Prior the Sacred Flame. If you have a paladin or a priest, you get a cool buff, and that buff was proccing damage. That damage was scaling with keystone level. We actually made that. We changed that to only scale with the priest or paladin, so that it doesn't have as much infinite scalability. So it feels like a cool bonus, but isn't going to be the difference between potentially a keystone level or more of player power. So long-winded answer. Hopefully that answered your question.
Fantastic answer. It's really interesting to get some insight into what dungeons to bring in which season. I really like the fact that you consider the thematic elements. So that's very cool. And as someone who healed all through Shadowlands, thank you for the theater paint change.
Yes.
Big bonus. Although I'm a demon hunter now, so it doesn't really matter.
Havoc is going to be pretty good this season.
Yes, I'm excited. All right. So in recent Blue Posts, the team did acknowledge that the community has had some concerns over the state of Mythic Plus in this first season. Participation numbers are obviously one indicator, but what other data points do you use to determine whether a Mythic Plus season has been successful?
That's an interesting question, because I feel like with The War Within, we've introduced new seasonal activity. So kind of the definition of what is successful for a season has really changed a lot with The War Within. Delves are something that we now have players who might not have been participating in any seasonal content at all are now able to participate in seasonal content. There were so many people on the team that were like, oh my God, I opened my first Great Vault ever in The War Within, and it was so cool, right? So that's something that we were really happy to include and are quite pleased with how that has played out. But I mean, that does mean that there was some impact on the Mythic Plus pool, because there were people who were doing Mythic Plus to participate in the season, even though that they dungeon content wasn't their favorite stuff. So that might have taken some people out of the Mythic Plus pool and moved them into another pool. But overall, that's still, we feel, really healthy for the game, as more people are doing things that they enjoy doing. A major focus of ours for Season 2 was to make sure that the people who want to do Mythic Plus are happy with Mythic Plus. Right. So there was a lot of focus on how that seasonal progression within Mythic Plus feels, and making sure that that was really satisfying. So that's something that we also have been looking at a lot with going into Season 2, as there's been a tremendous amount of changes there, as you might have seen.
Yes, and actually, I'll jump into my next question, because that's very related. There have been a number of changes and iterations on the Mythic Plus system announced already for Season 2, intending to address some of the pain points that were identified by the community. And as you mentioned, we want people who want to do Mythic Plus to enjoy doing Mythic Plus. Which of the changes coming up in Season 2 are you the most hopeful will have the biggest impact, and why?
There are so many.
Yeah, there are.
I will break this question down into parts, because I feel like that was how we kind of broke down the problem spaces as well. So ultimately, the goal is to get people into the right difficulty sooner, right? Like I just mentioned, the progression of how the season plays out for a player. Let's just focus on players who like Mythic Plus. Is something where we feel like we had a lot of work to do and could do better. Going into War Within Season 1, we had that kind of keystone level squish. But the way that played out, because of how the seasonal rewards were set up, it almost acted like a double squish, right? Like there was players who had 10 plus levels of progression in Dragonflight that really felt like they were only being appropriately rewarded from like 7 to 10. And at every keystone level in there, there was a big new challenge being added, from Peril to new affixes to Fortified / Tyrannical. So they were big steps up at each level, and that was something we really wanted to focus on specifically. For the player who might not have a static group to play with, is in pugs a lot more, making sure that progression feels a lot better. So we kind of rescaled the dungeons. Mythic Zeros are back to a weekly lockout and drop champion gear, so that hopefully Mythic Zeros can become an on-ramp for some of those players again. And then we also wanted to make sure that those early keys were rewarding. There was also a focus with this season on, we're calling it a focus, is one of the other goals with the season was we felt like the addition of Peril, which is the affix that kind of makes deaths more reduce more time from 5 seconds to 15 seconds, is something that when you're in like I said, like if you're in a coordinated group who's pushing really high and looking to get as maybe some of those higher ratings, that's something that is really interesting to play around. But if you're in a pug, that can feel a little bit overly punishing. So we wanted to add a new achievement with Keystone Legend for people to kind of incentivize those people who are looking for that extra bit of challenge beyond what normally our major focus is, which is primarily we look at Keystone Hero, right? Like if you can get to 2,500 plus, you can do your 10s. If you feel like you can achieve that, like you're happy, right? That's kind of where rewards essentially stop, the power of rewards especially. But for people who do want to push higher, we wanted to provide a little bit of a cosmetic reward to chase, as well as, we'd heard a lot of feedback about people who push those higher keys wanting to have a bit of a different experience, right? We've already kind of recognized that there's almost 2 audiences within Mythic Plus. And based on this conversation, you could argue there's 3 audiences. Yeah. There's the people who are in those lower keys, there's the people who are, just looking to get their 10s done, and then there's the people who want to push really hard.
Yes.
And we made some major changes going into the War Within for those people who want to push really high keys by adding, by essentially removing the weekly affix differences week over week, so that they can have a more consistent experience, which we've heard a lot of feedback about that being awesome. So we added resilient keystones for that audience also, so that they are kind of incentivized to move their high water mark up week over week. So when you defeat all the 12s, your keystone level won't deplete below that, etc. So that's something that we kind of added for that audience as well, because that's something where we've heard there was kind of a big gap between Keystone Hero and titles. So what if there was another step in there to maybe incentivize people to graduate into that next tier of Mythic Plus? So that was kind of the goal with that. Sorry, again, long-winded answer, but there's a lot to talk about and a lot of motivations behind some of these changes.
No, it's excellent because, as you mentioned, it's an endgame ecosystem for everyone, but with people have different goals going into it. So how do you address all of those various goals? And it sounds like you guys are really putting thought into, this group wants this group wants this group wants this. So as a player who's been in all of those groups, thank you.
Yeah. And like I said, having those goals that kind of incentivize you to have a more smooth progression, and then something that you can have frankly a point where you can ask yourself, like, all right, do I want to push for Keystone Legend? Nah, I'm good. I don't need to do that. But before, it was such a high wall to get to the next step, versus Keystone Hero to Keystone Master is quite a bit easier of a step. So we felt like that was already pretty good, but we felt like we missed the mark in those early keys. So we wanted to put a bit of focus there as well. So anyways, yeah.
Yes, well, we're very excited for season 2. I think it's going to be fantastic, even though Theater of Pain is coming back.
You'll be fine.
Yeah, again, I'm a demon hunter. I'll be fine. So a couple more Mythic Plus questions, and I do have a handful of raid questions because the Liberation of Undermine looks fantastic. So a couple more Mythic Plus, and then we can move on. Let's I think I'll move on to this one actually. Some feedback from the high key community, especially, so the people pushing those leaderboards, suggests that using pre-key buffs, such as those gained from follower dungeons, have been granting unintended advantages. Do you have any plans to change how non-group eligible buffs are handled in Mythic Plus for Season 2?
Yes. I mean, very simply, that's a bug that we're looking to resolve with Season 2. So that is actively being looked into right now, I believe, and will be fixed before Season 2 goes up.
Fantastic. That's the best answer we could hope for, honestly. Love it. So going back to, I guess, Season 1, a brief question about that. So we saw pretty narrow meta in Season 1, more so than past seasons where that top composition took up a massive kind of part of the high keys especially. Now, obviously, that's something you guys look at. You're seeing this. You need to deal with it. How do you reconcile that without negatively impacting other aspects of the end game like raid or PvP?
I think two things there, and this goes back to what we were just discussing. I think if you ask, those different audiences that we were just discussing,
right.
If you ask someone who's pushing for titles, they're going to have a different answer about how narrow they feel the meta is, and it will frankly be much more narrow for that audience. But I think when you look at people who are, again, just going for like Keystone Hero, that the meta, and we have a lot of data that shows the success rates in particular are something we look a lot at, like what the community feels is correct in terms of early on it was, you have to have a Resto Shaman. And
right.
then later in the season has become Disc Priest. But if you look at the groups that are forming that don't have those and their success rate versus the groups that do, again, in that Keystone Hero range, it's really quite healthy. We've talked a lot about actually like how can we like adjust that perception, because frankly, between you and I, that person who might be chasing the meta, who's playing Enhancement Shaman, and maybe has only been playing that Shaman for like 2 weeks, right, versus that Shadow Priest who's been playing their class or their spec for years, they are probably going to be more effective because they're so familiar with their class and they're going to pull off some of those clutch dispels and stuff, right? So there's something interesting. Yes, true. So there's interesting data points there that aren't really present or able to be seen by the community that we keep a close eye on. And in terms of making changes to the specs and not affecting other elements of the game, I mean, class balance is an art, and it is ever changing and ongoing. And I always, we were just talking about Theater of Pain. I think it's so interesting to me when you look at how does content impact, community perception about balance, where I've used this example a bunch, but it's totally valid for both Mythic Plus and raids, is we could make 0 changes to classes going into one season to the next, and just because of the landscape of the content, the meta could shift drastically, right? Like different classes have different strengths and weaknesses. Even just Season 1, it was so interesting to me to see, we were joking about Resto Shaman earlier, and there was a lot of community conversation are like, well, there's so many poison, debuffs in these dungeons. Of course, Resto Shaman are really powerful. And then we buff, prop paladins, and suddenly Resto Shaman now fall off, and Discipline Priests are most present again in those very high keys. And it's like, we didn't even touch the healers. Right? So it's a very like complex kind of web of interactions between our classes, which we think is really fun to play around and look to how do you play off these other members in your group and build those strengths that you can work towards. So we are constantly kind of looking at class balance week over week. We actually have a pretty fixed schedule where we both look at our classes, but we also look at our dungeons and raids in terms of like, the combat team is looking at what is the balance, and again, those success rates for each of our specs. And also on the encounter side, we look at kind of smoothing out some potential rough edges. For instance, tank busters were something that we looked a lot at in Season 1 late in the season, as well as Season 2. Where there was a lot of feedback coming from the community around, hey, you made these tank changes, and we think you should, essentially the community would call for the tank changes to be reverted. But what we talked about a lot was like, okay, well, there's two sides of this coin. There's the tank changes we made, and then there's the content that the players are experiencing. And maybe we missed the mark on our content changes when we made those tank changes, because we said we wanted, tank health to, feel like it isn't as spiky. And then we had to look at, okay, well, what does the incoming damage look like versus what are the tank's tools in their toolbox? And those sides of the coin are really important, that we're constantly looking at each of them and how they interact with one another. So we very much have a cadence that we regularly look at those things together as a group and try to make sure that experience, is reflected in the community, and they're having a good time with the dungeons and the raid, as it were.
That's awesome. It must be a never ending cycle, basically, to get that done, but commendable for sure. So before I get into raids, I'd like to hear from both of you, what dungeon are you most excited to see make its way into the dungeon pool for season 2?
Yeah, you want to take that?
Yeah, when I heard we were doing Undermine, I immediately walked into my leads desk. It was like, we're putting Motherlode in this season, right? Like, I was, as a fan of that, just that whole storyline, like, I love the goblins in that one little section and kicking the ball around on boss one. Like, I don't know, I'm very excited for that dungeon to make its return.
Yeah, I am personally excited about Operation Floodgate, which is a brand new dungeon coming with the Undermine update. That's going to be super fun. And I'm excited for Big Mama, just because I love acronyms in WoW, because the team never ceases to amaze me with their amazing acronym making abilities. Because Big Mama, the Mama is an acronym, and it stands for, let me see if I remember this, Mech Operating Miniature Mobile Aircraft.
Right.
And would you guess that it summons miniature mobile aircraft, aka drones, as part of the encounter?
It's great. Yeah, I think we tested that one. It looks like a lot of fun. But I'm gonna have to side with Katrina on this one. Motherlode is probably one of my favorite dungeons you've ever had in Mythic Plus, so I'm really excited for it to come back. Moving to some raid questions for the last little bit that I've got you guys. Speaking of goblins, we would love to hear more about what the internal process is when it comes to designing a raid within a patch. So does like the one team decide the story direction and they go, hey, next patch is goblins, and then the encounter team gets to run with that and make a goblin themed raid, or is it an entirely different process altogether?
Well, that's pretty much our process. It really is like, it's very fun to come in at that point in the story, because the story is established. You kind of have an idea of where we're going, and we kind of have to fill in all the pieces. So basically, pitch for Undermine is, hey, Gallywix is retreating into his headquarters, and he sent out all his top employees out into the streets to take over. And so honestly, the encounter team just ran with that and had just an amazing time coming up with wacky goblin mechanics and really leaning into like that tinker aesthetic for goblins, and coming up with like we have promoter Rick Reverb, who his whole focus is working with sonic machines and dropping amps and stuff from the sky. It's been an awesome time to work on this patch, because goblins are just so core to WoW, and it's an enjoyable experience.
Yeah, and for me in particular, like looking at the War Within and the World Soul Saga holistically, we knew from the onset we had to go to Undermine, right? Like, this is an expansion that was primarily set underground, and we were like, okay, Undermine, it's underground. If we're ever going to go to this place, it's got to be now. So there was very much lots of fun Easter eggs that were kind of planted all throughout the expansion. Kind of, it's not a coincidence that there was these kind of, interspersed goblin encampments all throughout the Ringing Deeps, right? And then, it turns out the Ringing Deeps is where they busted the hole in the wall to get to the Undermine. So very, very fun to get to visit this location. It's a place we've wanted to do for so long, and this felt like the perfect opportunity to go there.
You can tell just from the testing and the aesthetics that you guys had a great time making this raid. It just looks exciting and fun and fresh, so we're really excited. If you had to pick one theme, I mean, it very well might be goblins, as your favorite to design encounters for, so like goblins, legion, void, etc., what would it be if you could pick your top theme?
This is a hard question. Like, there's different challenges that come out of designing for those themes. Like, so for one, I think any opportunity to work with like a brand new culture, it's daunting. It's a daunting design challenge in itself to come up with something new for something you've never seen before. But I think something particular with WoW is you have 20 years of player expectation of what a creature does, and extrapolating on that has been really fun, especially with goblins in 11.1. Like basically being able to design towards that with some fresh perspectives it's just been a joy, honestly. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's interesting how you phrase that. As an ex-encounter designer myself as well, you always have these ideas for a mechanic, right? Like, oh, what if I did this cool thing in this encounter? But you never want to like force that into an encounter. You want to wait. You need to wait for that thematic, for that fantasy to align with that. And I always loved mind control. Like, I think all of my encounters ever had some form of mind control in one way, shape, or form. Because I always think it's hilarious when players kill each other. Because I love PvP in the raid. So both goblins and old gods check that box. So
okay, yeah. No, that definitely makes a lot of sense. And so I have you to thank for every time someone killed me on a past encounter with mind control. Thanks, Morgan. What is the approach to designing mechanics that are challenging enough to not be boring, but not overly difficult or frustrating? And how do you determine where that line is?
We were just having all those Mythic Plus discussions about, it's a constant balancing act. I think personally for me, when I kind of like comes to designing mechanics, I really start with like, does this mechanic mesh well with the story or the concept of the boss I'm trying to tell? Is the mechanic fun? Is it repeatable? Can I come back in 4 weeks and still have some type of challenge with this? Or am I like fully mastering it? And there's a variety. Like we want all those things, I think, across all the bosses of the raid, some type of variety of fun and different ways. And then on the flip side, other axis of that is tuning it, right? So when it comes to designing something challenging enough, does this particular mechanic have enough time to tell what's happening? Does the player have enough time to react? Even with, raid encounters, they have such a gravitas. Like you see a giant dragon swoop across your screen, that needs to take a certain amount of time to really have its epicness, and it's really just finding that balancing act of like, what's enough time for players to react? What's enough time to tell a story? What feels good? What feels fun and exhilarating for the player? That's top of mind for encounters across the board. I don't know, Morgan, if you had anything to add to that.
Yeah, for me, when I think about that, I think there's two thoughts. One, what difficulty is it, right? That's a huge part of it for me, because when we think about, challenge and how difficult it should be, it has to be viewed through the context of, okay, well, where am I? Am I in a normal raid? When I think about normal raids, I think about like, you're allowed mistakes. How many mistakes are you allowed to make before you wipe? There's no one mechanic that should just instantly wipe you on normal, unless it's maybe the end boss. And even then I would argue, maybe don't do that. On heroic, maybe it kills you if you make a mistake, but it doesn't kill the whole raid. Again, you can make arguments about, okay, boss 1 versus the end boss. The rules get a little muddied there. And then Mythic is just everything kills you instantly no matter what, right? That little swirly on the ground might tickle it enough. All right, you're going to die in Mythic Raid, right? So to me, it's a lot of like, where am I? What's the context? And then speaking of where am I, where is it in the fight, right? There's a lot I think you could say. If by far the most challenging part of the fight, and it's like this huge jump up in difficulty, and it's so punishing to make a mistake, and it's 15 minutes into the fight. Oh my God, that's exhausting, right? That's not going to feel very great as a player. It's one of the reasons we actually moved away from our end bosses. Gosh, I think the longest one we ever made was like 22 minutes or something. It was just like a marathon of difficulty. Yeah. And we've kind of stepped away from that just because of this exact problem. It's like, gosh, it feels so bad to wipe 15 minutes into a fight because, well, the fight's getting progressively harder. And now that first, 14 minutes I've done 100 times. And it's like, okay, we're all asleep until this last minute. And maybe that's not the best way to inject difficulty into a fight. So very interesting question. Lots of nuance to it.
No, that's really interesting. All right, I've got time for one more question, I believe. So, with the racial first coming up, I guess I'll ask this one: secret mythic phases. Always a huge topic of conversation when the race roll first comes up. Is there going to be a secret phase, right? Especially now that we haven't been PTR testing final bosses. And it seems like it's something that's pretty well received within the community at large. What's the consensus on when, if, and how to implement a secret mythic phase?
We love mythic phases. I think part of mythic is the spectacle. You know, we get the stream, we get race to roll first going on. I think when we want to do a mythic phase, it's really when does it make sense to inject something like that? Does it fit the boss? Does it feel extra special as a result of when we do them? It's when we put a secret or a twist in and it's obvious, it doesn't feel quite as surprising or exciting. So we have to be very careful of when we plan to add those types of things. Morgan, I'm not sure if you had anything else to add to that, but
I mean, go ahead. Yeah, we never want to set the expectation that we're always going to do this, because then it's not really a secret.
Right. Exactly.
We talk a lot about novelty within the team to try to keep things fresh. We know seasonal content is exciting, but also it's easy to fall into, I'll just call it the trap as a developer of, well, what did we do last time? Do that again. And as a player,
Right.
you want to see new and interesting things and constantly trying new ideas. It's one of the beauties of working on World of Warcraft is we, have been doing this for a long time, and there's always something new we can try. And if it works, awesome. We can put it in our, utility belt of options we can use in the future. And if it doesn't work, don't do it again. The community will be more than happy to let us know that they didn't like it. And we're always listening for that and excited to hear that, right? So very much it's a tool in the tool belt, but we only want to use it when it makes sense. And frankly, when we have a really cool idea, right?
Right.
If there's something that's just all right, we have to do this. How do we do this? We also need to be careful not to make that aspect feel like the true version of the fight, this has got such a cool story moment in it that all of us miss out on. Where with the, introduction of story mode raids, we think that's an awesome opportunity to make sure that these epic story moments, like the fall of the Lich King or something that everyone can experience. And if some really epic story beat only happens in Mythic, then that kind of goes against the goals of that new story mode difficulty. So that's also something that we have to be considerate of when we're building these epic mythic encounters.
That makes a lot of sense. I have to admit, I lament the fact that the race roll first was not a streamed event back in Nighthold, because I go back and watch that cinematic of Gul'dan dying and Illidan with the wings coming out regularly, and it's just such an epic moment. I would have loved to see players and casters' reactions to that live as it was happening when the first team, got to that phase. So
I hate to rub it in, but I got to watch that live.
Oh, so fun.
Thanks, Morgan.
Yeah, thanks. So those are the kind of moments I know that we all love as a community, watching, those kinds of things take place. So I'm glad you guys enjoy secret mythic phases as much as you do. I believe that is all the time I have for today. Thank you again both so much for chatting. Really great to get some more insight on 11.1 and the lessons learned from Season 1, and just super excited for Undermined. I can't wait for the patch to come out and get going into the new content myself. Thank you again both so much.
Thank you so much.
Very, very much.